The living room felt smaller than I remembered. All 12 of them sat facing me. My aunts, uncles, and cousins arranged like a jury. I stood near the fireplace, my hands steady, my voice calm. My name is Victoria, and at 28 years old, I was about to face the biggest confrontation of my life. "We need Grandma's jewelry collection," Uncle Paul announced, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. "For tradition. The family heirloom needs to stay united." I looked at each face. Aunt Marion smiled smugly. Cousins Derek and Nathan exchanged knowing glances. They'd clearly planned this intervention carefully. I'd received the call 3 days ago, a family meeting at Uncle Paul's house. "Nothing unusual," they'd said. "Just a gathering." "I appreciate you all coming," I replied quietly. "But Grandma left those pieces to me specifically." "Don't be selfish," Aunt Marion snapped. "Your grandmother would want us to keep the family treasures together." The irony stung. They had no idea what Grandma wanted. I did. "You're being disrespectful," Uncle Paul continued, his voice rising. "Your grandmother raised all of us. We all deserve a piece of her legacy." Cousin Nathan jumped in. "Mom says you're only keeping them out of spite. She said Grandma probably didn't even mean to give them all to you." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest. They were rewriting history, just like I'd expected. My hands remained unclenched. My breathing stayed even. This was exactly what I'd prepared for. "Grandmother left a will," I said calmly. "You can all read it if you want." "Wills can be challenged," Uncle Paul shot back. "And family tradition matters more than lawyers' paperwork. Your grandfather would never want this kind of division." Aunt Marion leaned forward, her eyes cold. "Are you sure about this? Because family can forget about people who don't cooperate. People who betray tradition." The threat hung in the air. I asked the question I'd been waiting to ask. "Are you completely sure that's what Grandmother wanted?" The room went quiet. Something in my tone made them hesitate. Uncle Paul cleared his throat, sensing the moment shifting slightly. "Of course we're sure," he said, but his voice carried less certainty now. "We're her family. We know." "All of you come sit down," Aunt Marion interrupted, patting the couch next to her. "Victoria, honey, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to honor your grandmother's memory. That jewelry should be shared. Split equally among the family. That's tradition." More relatives nodded. Cousin Derek smiled that fake smile I'd seen 100 times. They were closing ranks now, moving into the second phase. Pressure. More voices. More people agreeing with them. Cousin Jennifer stood up. "I can't believe you're being this stubborn. Grandma loved all of us equally. Why should you get everything while we get nothing?" Another cousin I barely knew piped up from the corner. "Family tradition means sacrifice. It means sharing." They kept coming, voices overlapping, and I stayed quiet. This was the social circle tightening. I'd expected exactly this. My grandmother had warned me it would happen. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift backward 3 years. Grandma was sitting in her garden, the roses blooming around us in shades of red and pink. She was smaller then, frail but still sharp. Still herself. "Come sit with me, Victoria," she'd said, patting the bench beside her. I remember the afternoon sun warming my face. I remember how her hand felt in mine. Paper-thin, spotted with age, but warm. "I need to tell you something," she'd whispered. "About the jewelry. About what really matters." She'd told me then about the pieces. Where they came from. What they meant. She'd talked for hours, and I'd recorded every word in my heart. She'd shown me documents, photographs, letters written decades ago. "These aren't just pretty things," she'd explained. "They're stories. They're pieces of our family's real history. And I need someone to protect that truth." I'd listened as she'd told me about my grandfather's proposal, how he'd saved for a year to buy her engagement ring, about the necklace her mother had worn at her wedding, smuggled out of a country during wartime, about each piece, each one a memory, each one a truth. "I'm leaving them all to you, Victoria," she'd said. "Not because you're my favorite, though you might be." She'd smiled. "Because you'll protect the story. You'll honor where they came from." The flashback shifted. I was 17, and Grandma was visiting from out of state. That visit, I discovered something about my relatives I wish I hadn't. I'd overheard Cousin Derek on the phone in the kitchen. Yeah, once the old lady goes, we're selling everything. That jewelry collection is worth serious money. My mom thinks we can each get at least 50 grand if we split it right. Nathan had laughed. The kid probably won't even know what to do with it. We'll just tell her it's tradition to keep it in the family, and she'll hand it over. I'd stood frozen behind the pantry door, my heart pounding. They'd been planning this for years. Not out of love for Grandma. Out of greed. That night, I told Grandma what I'd heard. She'd gone very quiet. Then she'd gone to her lawyer. Everything changed after that. She'd updated her will. She'd given me papers to keep safe. She'd made me promise to hold on to the truth, no matter what pressure they put on me. They'll call you selfish, she'd said. They'll say you're dishonoring the family. They'll try to shame you. But Victoria, the truth matters more than their feelings. I opened my eyes back in Uncle Paul's living room. The voices were still going. Aunt Marion was now talking about how disappointed Grandma would be, how I was breaking up the family, how this was cruel and selfish. But I held on to what Grandma had told me in that moment, sitting in the garden with roses blooming around us. There's something else, she'd said quietly, reaching into her pocket. The jewelry, it's worth far more than they think. Much more. There are appraisals, certificates, historical documentation. Each piece tells a story that makes it valuable in ways money can't measure. She'd handed me an envelope, sealed with her own handwriting on the front. For Victoria. Open when they ask for the jewelry. I still had that envelope. It sat in my safety deposit box at the bank, right where she'd told me to keep it. They're going to want to sell it, Grandma had continued. They're going to want to divide it like it's cash. But these pieces are part of our history. Real history. And someone needs to protect that. She'd looked at me with such intensity in her eyes. Can you be that person, Victoria? Can you be brave enough to tell the truth? Even when it's hard? I'd promised her I would. Back in the present, the pressure was mounting. Uncle Paul had started talking about involving the family lawyer. Aunt Marion was threatening to bring in community elders who could mediate the situation. Cousin Derek was suggesting that maybe I'd been manipulated by Grandma into this, that maybe I didn't understand what I was doing. We should all calm down, Aunt Marion said, her voice dripping with false concern. Victoria is clearly emotional about this. Young people don't always understand what's best for the family. Maybe we should just take the jewelry ourselves, Nathan muttered, and several relatives nodded. My voice when I spoke was quieter than theirs but somehow louder. No, I said simply. The room stopped. They weren't used to me saying no. This isn't about me being selfish, I continued. This isn't about tradition. This is about what you really want, and we all know what that is. Uncle Paul's face went red. How dare you? I know, I interrupted calmly. About the conversation Derek and Nathan had in the kitchen 3 years ago. About selling the jewelry. About the $50,000 each. The silence was deafening. Derek's face went pale. Nathan suddenly became very interested in his shoes. Several relatives looked confused. Clearly, they hadn't been part of that original plan. I know, I continued, that this was planned before I even turned 18. I know you've been waiting for Grandma to pass away so you could pressure me into giving this up. Aunt Marion started to protest, but I held up my hand. What you don't know, I said, is that Grandma knew. And she prepared for exactly this moment. A woman I barely noticed suddenly moved. She was sitting near the back, one of Grandma's oldest friends, Mrs. Hampton. She'd come with us to the funeral. She'd been at many family gatherings over the years, but I'd never seen her speak much. I witnessed something, Mrs. Hampton said quietly, standing up. 3 weeks before your grandmother passed away, she came to see me. She was concerned about family pressure. She asked me to be a witness to her final wishes regarding the jewelry collection. Aunt Marion's face went white. That doesn't matter. She was probably confused near the end. No, Mrs. Hampton interrupted. She was sharp as a tack. She explained exactly what she wanted and why. She told me about the pieces, about their real value and their historical significance. She told me she was leaving everything to Victoria because Victoria was the only one who cared about preserving the truth rather than selling the pieces off. The room erupted. Several relatives started talking over each other. Uncle Paul stood up, his face flushed with anger. But Mrs. Hampton wasn't finished. She also told me, the older woman continued, her voice clear and firm, that if any of you tried to pressure Victoria into giving up the jewelry, I was to come forward and confirm her real wishes. Not tradition. Not family pressure. Truth. The pressure shifted then. Cousin Derek, his voice shaking, stood up and blurted out the real reason they wanted the jewelry so badly. Fine. Fine, you want the truth? Nathan and I are in debt. Serious debt. We thought if we could sell Grandma's collection, we could pay it off. We hoped you'd just give it to us without making a fuss. The confession hung in the air like a bad smell. Several relatives looked shocked. Others looked ashamed. A few looked like they'd been planning the same thing. Uncle Paul tried to recover. That's not the only reason. The jewelry should stay in the family. It should be kept safe. Safe where? I asked. Safe in a pawn shop? Safe in a jewelry store display case where you'd sold it already. You're being cruel, Aunt Marion said, but her voice had lost its confidence. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. And that terrified them more than anger ever could. I'm going to tell you something, I said. But I need all of you to understand something first. Grandma didn't choose me to be mean to the rest of you. She chose me because she trusted me with something important. The truth about our family. The real story behind these pieces. I took a breath. I'm willing to share that story. I'm willing to tell you about where these pieces came from, what they mean, and why they matter. But I'm not going to hand them over. Not to be split up. Not to be sold. Not because of tradition or pressure. Aunt Marion tried one more time. Her voice became soft, almost pleading. Victoria, honey, all we're asking is that you think about your family. Think about how your cousins are suffering. Think about... I'll agree to something, I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. I'll agree to one condition. Everyone leaned forward. They thought I was about to give in. I want an independent appraisal, I said. A professional appraiser will evaluate the entire collection. They'll document the pieces, verify their authenticity, and determine their actual value. Then you can all know what we're actually talking about. Cousin Derek laughed. That won't change anything. You still won't give us the jewelry. Maybe not, I agreed. But at least we'll have facts instead of assumptions. Uncle Paul waved his hand dismissively. Fine. Get your appraisal. It won't matter. The jewelry belongs with the family, whether it's worth $100 or $100,000. They thought they'd won. They thought the appraisal would be quick and simple, and that I'd still refuse to hand over the pieces, and eventually they'd give up. They had no idea what was coming. What they didn't know was that I'd already made the arrangements weeks ago. The moment I'd received that phone call about the family meeting, I'd known exactly what would happen. I'd known them too well not to predict their moves. I'd contacted one of the most respected appraisers in the state. Not a quick, casual evaluation. A thorough, professional assessment. The kind that takes time and produces documentation that can't be questioned. I'd given the appraiser everything Grandma had left me. The pieces, the photographs, the letters, the historical documents, everything. And I'd asked for something specific. Not just a value, but a story. A complete understanding of what these pieces represented. The appraiser had gotten back to me yesterday. The report was thick, detailed, and absolutely devastating to my relatives' plans. When do you want to do this? Aunt Marion asked, trying to sound casual. The appraiser can meet with us tomorrow afternoon, I said. They've already agreed to come to my house. The surprise on their faces was worth everything I'd endured in the past hour. Your house? Uncle Paul sputtered. Why would they come to your house? Because, I said simply, that's where the jewelry is. And that's where I want this done. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Grandma, about her strength, about how she trusted me to handle this. I went to my bedroom and opened the envelope she'd left me, the one with her handwriting on the front. Inside was a letter, written in her shaky but determined script. Dear Victoria, if you're reading this, it's because they've asked for the jewelry. I knew they would. I've known for a long time what some of your relatives are really like. Underneath the smiles and the family talk, they see our treasures as currency, nothing more. But you're different. You've always been different. You listened to my stories. You asked me questions about where things came from. You understood that family history matters. The pieces I'm leaving you are worth more than you probably know. But their monetary value isn't what matters. What matters is what they represent. What they mean. Each piece tells a story about sacrifice, about love, about survival. These aren't just beautiful things. They're proof that our family endured. That we mattered. When they pressure you, and they will, remember why you're standing your ground. You're not doing it because you want to hurt them. You're doing it because the truth deserves to be protected. I love you more than words can say. Grandma. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my heart. Tomorrow would change everything. The appraiser, Mr. Wallace, arrived at my house at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes, and he carried his expertise with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 40 years studying beautiful things. My relatives arrived at 2:15. All of them. Even the ones who'd claimed they were too busy for the initial confrontation. Word had gotten around, and now they were all curious to see what the appraisal would reveal. I'd arranged the jewelry carefully on my dining room table, each piece on its own velvet pad. The light from the window caught the stones and made them glow. Mr. Wallace pulled out his loupe, his scales, his documentation tools. He began the process methodically, examining each piece with intense focus. My relatives watched from the doorway, silent for once. An hour passed. Then another. The air in the room felt electric, like something important was happening even though Mr. Wallace hadn't said a word. Finally, he looked up. "These are remarkable," he said simply. "Truly remarkable. I'm going to need to verify several of these pieces through historical records. Some of these are much more significant than I would have expected." Aunt Marian's eyes lit up greedily. She probably heard significant and thought it meant expensive. "Give me 3 more hours," Mr. Wallace said. "I want to do this properly." When Mr. Wallace finished, he spread his findings across the table. The first truth dropped like a stone. "The engagement ring," he said, pointing to the centerpiece, a stunning diamond with intricate gold work. This was created in 1952 by a master craftsman named Heinrich Feldmann. Feldmann was a German jeweler who fled persecution during the war. He only created about 200 pieces in his lifetime, most of them before he died in 1965. He looked at me. "Do you know who gave this to your grandmother?" "My grandfather," I said quietly. "He saved for a year to buy it." "Your grandfather understood the value of what he was purchasing," Mr. Wallace said. "Not just financial value. He bought from one of the most respected craftsmen of the era. This ring is documented. It's traced. And it's worth approximately $30,000. I heard Cousin Derek gasp. Aunt Marian's face flushed red, but this time with a different kind of excitement. "Greed." Mr. Wallace continued. "The necklace, the one with the rubies and pearls, is from approximately 1920. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and the stones are of high quality. But more importantly," he paused for effect, "this piece has a documented history. It belonged to a woman named Maria Rossi, who escaped Italy in 1942. According to the letters I found with the piece, she wore this necklace on the day she escaped. It's a piece of historical significance, not just financial." The appraiser's second truth drop was the final blow to their plans. "Your grandmother kept exceptional records," Mr. Wallace explained, holding up a folder thick with documentation. Letters, photographs, certificates of authenticity, historical research. She understood the real value of what she possessed. He pulled out a document that made Aunt Marian's face go pale. "In her will," Mr. Wallace read, "your grandmother explicitly stated that these pieces are to be preserved as a family historical collection. She stipulated that they are never to be sold individually or as a group. They are to remain together and be preserved for future generations." The room went silent. Dead silent. "Furthermore," Mr. Wallace continued, his voice steady and official, "the total documented value of this collection is approximately $187,000. But that value is only valid if the pieces remain together and properly documented. If they're sold separately or broken up, the value decreases significantly. A collector would pay maybe half that for scattered pieces without the historical context." He looked directly at my relatives. "If you'd sold these pieces individually, You would have made far less money than you thought. And you would have destroyed irreplaceable historical documents. The silence in the room was suffocating. I watched as the realization spread across their faces. Realization that not only were they not getting the jewelry, but also that their entire plan had been based on greed rather than understanding. Mrs. Hampton, still present as Grandma's witness, stepped forward. She took the appraiser's report and began reading Grandma's explicit instructions aloud, her voice clear and compassionate. "These pieces represent the survival of our family through difficult times," Mrs. Hampton read. "They represent sacrifice, love, and resilience. Victoria will protect this collection and preserve it for future generations, not as wealth, but as history. This is my final wish." A cousin I rarely spoke to started crying. Not tears of anger, but tears of shame. She'd come hoping to profit from our grandmother's legacy, and now she understood that our grandmother had been trying to teach us something far more important than greed. Uncle Paul slumped in a chair. His face had gone gray. Aunt Marion looked like she might be sick. The younger cousins, the ones who'd been pressured into supporting the scheme, looked absolutely humiliated. "I can't believe this," Cousin Derek whispered. "All this time we thought." "We know what you thought," I said quietly. "You thought you could pressure me into giving you what wasn't yours. You thought tradition and family obligation would force my hand. You didn't think about what Grandma actually wanted. You didn't care about the stories behind these pieces. You just saw dollar signs." They tried to recover. Derek suggested that maybe the appraisal was wrong. Nathan implied that perhaps I'd coached the appraiser to give favorable results. Uncle Paul demanded to see the documentation himself. But Mrs. Hampton was there, confirming every word. Mr. Wallace was there, professional and unshakable, explaining the historical significance of each piece. And worst of all for them, I was there. Calm, composed, and absolutely certain of my position. "Your grandmother was very clear," Mrs. Hampton said, looking directly at Uncle Paul. "She told me that she loved you all. But she also told me that some of you had shown her, over many years, that you valued money more than family. That you valued taking more than giving." "That's not fair," Aunt Marion protested weakly. "It's completely fair," Mrs. Hampton replied. "Your mother understood her children. She understood their hearts. And she made her choices accordingly. The witness had done her job perfectly. She'd preserved Grandma's truth, exactly as she'd been asked to do." Word spread through the family like wildfire. By the next day, everyone knew what had happened. The relatives who hadn't been at my house heard the story, and social perception shifted like a tide turning. Relatives who'd been silent on the matter suddenly started defending me publicly. Cousins who'd been planning to support the pressure campaign suddenly claimed they'd never really been part of it. The family group chat, which had been buzzing with support for taking the jewelry, went quiet. Some people, I learned, were genuinely ashamed. An aunt I'd always liked called me and apologized. "I got caught up in it," she admitted. "I thought there was something to the tradition argument. But hearing about what your grandmother actually wanted. I'm sorry, Victoria. I'm really sorry." Others simply disappeared from family conversations. I heard through the grapevine that Cousin Derek had left town, embarrassed by his own behavior. Uncle Paul barely spoke to anyone at the next family gathering. But the most interesting thing happened with Aunt Marion. She sent me a letter, formal and carefully written, acknowledging that I'd been right, that she'd been wrong, and that she respected my decision to protect Grandma's legacy. It wasn't a real apology, there was still pride in it, still an attempt to control the narrative, but it was something. It was her way of acknowledging that she'd lost the battle. 3 weeks after the appraisal, I received official documentation. Mr. Wallace had completed his full evaluation and provided me with a certificate of authenticity for the entire collection. Each piece was documented, photographed, and catalogued. More importantly, the documentation included the letters from my grandmother. Her explicit instructions that the jewelry was to be preserved as a family historical archive. The legal implication was clear. If anyone tried to challenge the will or pressure me further, they would be fighting not just me, but also the weight of legal documentation and historical significance. The jewelry was no longer just pieces that my relatives wanted to steal. They were now officially recognized as important historical artifacts. Taking them would be like stealing from a museum. Uncle Paul's lawyer contacted me once, very quietly, suggesting that perhaps we could reach a settlement. I asked them to leave me alone. They did. About 2 months after the appraisal, Cousin Derek reached out to me. He was humiliated, broken, and honestly sorry in a way that Uncle Paul and Aunt Marian never seemed capable of being. "I owe you an apology," he said over coffee, his voice shaking. "No, I owe Grandma an apology. We were horrible. We saw her as nothing but a source of money. We didn't care about her as a person." I listened as he talked about his debt, about how he'd made terrible financial choices, about how he'd convinced himself that pressuring me was justified because his situation was desperate. "It wasn't," I said simply. "Your situation was your responsibility. Not Grandma's. Not mine." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know that now. I'm getting help. I'm dealing with my debt properly. And I'm sorry for being such a terrible person." I believed him. Not because his apology was perfect, it wasn't, but because he was actually taking responsibility for his own choices rather than blaming me or our grandmother for his failures. My quiet strength came not from victory, but from clarity. I'd been tested, and I hadn't broken. I'd been pressured, and I hadn't given in. More importantly, I'd honored my grandmother's wishes not because it benefited me, but because it was the right thing to do. The jewelry remained safe in my home, documented and preserved. I began to research the pieces more deeply, learning the full stories behind each one. I found documents about Maria Rossi, the Italian woman whose ruby necklace had survived the war. I discovered letters from Heinrich Feldman's estate about my grandfather's purchase of the engagement ring. Each piece became alive to me in a new way. They weren't just pretty things. They were evidence. They were proof that my family had endured, had survived, had loved each other across generations. And I was the keeper of that proof. Here's what surprised me most. My strength came from understanding something that my relatives never seemed to grasp. My grandmother hadn't chosen me because I was her favorite. She'd chosen me because she'd seen, over years and years, that I valued people more than things. That I asked questions about stories rather than about prices. She'd known this moment was coming. She'd prepared me for it not with anger or spite, but with truth. With documentation. With a clear conscience. Every time I looked at that engagement ring, I didn't just see a beautiful piece of jewelry. I saw my grandfather's love, expressed through a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Every time I held the ruby necklace, I saw a woman's courage, her determination to survive. My relatives had seen merchandise. I saw history. And my grandmother had trusted me to be the one who understood the difference. The family dynamics changed, but not in the way I might have expected. Some relatives drifted away, embarrassed by their behavior. But others came closer. They started asking me about the pieces, wanting to understand their histories. They began to see the jewelry collection as what it really was. A family treasure in the truest sense. 2 of my younger cousins, kids who'd been pressured into the confrontation by their parents, actually apologized without being prompted. They'd grown up watching their parents try to take advantage of me, and they decided they didn't want to be like that. My family wasn't healed. Some wounds were too deep for that. But we'd all learned something. The relatives who mattered learned that you can't force tradition. You can only create it through honest choices. The ones who didn't change, well, they stopped being part of my active life, and I made peace with that. A year after the appraisal, I did something my grandmother would have loved. I created a small exhibit of the pieces in a local museum. Not permanently. Just for 3 months. But it allowed other people to see what my grandmother had worked so hard to preserve. The exhibit included the pieces, the stories, the letters, everything. People came and learned about Maria Rossi's escape, about my grandfather's love and sacrifice, about my grandmother's determination to keep these stories alive. Watching strangers touch the glass cases and read the plaques, learning about people they'd never met, made me understand why my grandmother had been so insistent about preservation. These stories mattered. Not because the pieces were valuable, but because they meant something. Because they connected us to real people, real struggles, real love. Several relatives came to the exhibit. I watched them read the stories as if they were seeing our family for the first time. I think they finally understood. I stand now in my home, looking at the jewelry collection safely stored in its place of honor. I'm still 28 years old. I'm still the keeper of these pieces. But I'm not defined by the jewelry anymore. And I'm not defined by my relatives' expectations either. I'm defined by my choice to tell the truth. By my decision to honor what my grandmother had actually wanted. Even when it was hard. by my refusal to let pressure, shame, or family guilt dictate my actions. My grandmother taught me that real strength isn't about winning arguments. It's about knowing who you are and staying true to that, even when the whole world is telling you to compromise. The jewelry will stay together. The stories will be preserved. And future generations of my family will understand not just what these pieces are, but why they matter. That's the legacy I'm building. Not of wealth but of truth. Not of things but of values. Not of taking but of protecting. And that, I finally understand, is everything.